Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aarohi.
I'm Dylan.
I'm Myhana.
I'm Becky, and today we're going to talk about what it was like to study abroad as women of color. As a part of our university curricula, we each spent one semester at a host institution outside of the US, namely in China and Japan.
There are many topics we could discuss in relation to our study abroad experience, but we wanted to focus on how intersectionality, or a lack thereof, affected our time abroad.
How we think and talk about race and identity is situated in history and geography. Systems of oppression can look very different from one cultural context to the next, so the concept of identity is dynamic.
Culture informs language and language informs culture. When abroad, we didn't always have the words to describe who we are and the kinds of oppressions we face as we move through the world.
Even though we've been studying Mandarin and Japanese for some time now, it was a challenge to describe ourselves in a way that was more than just skin deep.
In English, I can use the word intersectionality to describe that I am Black and a woman and part of an immigrant family. However, intersectionality didn't even exist in English until very recently, only being popularized in the last decade and a half.
So what does intersectionality mean outside the United States context? What shape does it take in cultures that think about race and identity differently? The term itself is gradually finding voice in other languages. For example, in Japanese you would say intersectionality.
But that sounds like a loan word.
That's because it is.
And it's not translated too well in Mandarin either. Jiao Cha Xing means something along the lines of a literal crossroads and identity. These partial and oftentimes too literally translated terms speak to why we, as women of color, oftentimes had trouble explaining who we are to people in Japan and China. And this fed into why we had hesitations about going abroad in the first place. I had reservations about going abroad to China because it was a harder decision to make than the easier option of going to Europe, where there's more visible diversity. In China, I thought it was highly unlikely that I'd meet anyone who looked even slightly similar to me, much less anyone with their hair in locks and ties to the Caribbean and America. This fear sat in opposition to the fact that going abroad to China for a second time would really improve my ability to speak Mandarin in the long run. With all of this in mind, I still decided to board the plane and take my Black American ass to Beijing.
Before I left for study abroad, I was afraid of how beauty standards in Japan might define the way that I was perceived. I had an idea that some people might stare at me or what they might say to me, or that I'd have pictures taken of me without my permission. But I hoped that it wouldn't be as stressful as I'd imagined, since I was extremely excited to finally go to Japan after years of study.
Before I left for study abroad, I was confident that I would encounter some of the same stereotypes about Indian people as I have elsewhere, and that most people I interacted with would be shocked to come across a young brown girl who can speak Japanese. This would be my first time in Japan, and I couldn't have been more keen to finally see all of those places that I had only been reading about thus far. But I wanted to be better prepared. Unfortunately, most of those around me who had embarked on a similar adventure, surprise, surprise, were white men.
Before I left for study abroad, I was anxious. I had never been to Japan before, so to ameliorate my anxiety, I scoured the internet for resources and experiences of people who share similar identities to me. Based on what I saw of Black bodies being represented in Japanese media, I knew how Black Americans are perceived, but I had no clue, as a Kenyan American, how Africans are perceived, or whether that even mattered at all, because Blackness is such a beautiful spectrum. But I hoped that Tokyo's international draw would at least reduce the surprise of seeing a Black person in Japan. All this to say is that we know what our bodies mean in a US context, but the subtleties of our identities were lost in translation. Without intersectionality, we are just brown.
Female.
Foreign.
A spectacle.
For example, when I was in Beijing, I had a roommate who was white, had blonde hair, and was also American like myself. One night we went out, and this Chinese woman stops and asks where we're both from. We respond that we're both American. She looks from me to my roommate, and then back at me with a rather confused expression on herself. Shama? What? She then proceeds to ask how both of us looking the way we did, how we could possibly be from the same country. Because in China, Black people can only be African. This interaction and many others like it made me really frustrated that an aspect of my identity could be so easily dismissed as a lie, even as I spoke my truths. 对啊，我真的是一个黑美国人. Yes, I am both American and Black.
While I studied abroad in Kyoto, I found it difficult to escape unsolicited attention. This was to say that, as a foreigner in Japan, I knew to some extent that I would be paid attention to. But what I couldn't anticipate was to become the target of a variety of negative comments. This was only exacerbated by the fact that many people thought I couldn't speak Japanese, and so would often insult me right in front of my face. On one of the first days of being in Japan, I decided that I wanted to eat at the student cafeteria. My group and I had been out all day filling out paperwork, and I was famished. While trying to decide what to eat, though, I noticed that a group of cafeteria workers were mocking me, staring at me, pointing, miming the parts of my body that were different from theirs, and laughing. I lost my appetite, put my tray down, and didn't eat. Being in public in Japan was a constant act of courage. Japanese society is perceived stereotypically to be extremely polite, but the way I was treated often didn't measure up to what, in my cultural context, is considered to be polite. I found myself asking, who determines which bodies are allowed to be in public without being ridiculed or harassed? Who deemed that I was unworthy? There was only one answer that I could come up with, and it had to do with my particular kind of foreignness.
Studying abroad in Tokyo, I found myself constantly negotiating between being hyper-visible and invisible. Even though Tokyo is the largest metropolis in the world, I would often hear people remark, Nihon ni chairo no hito mo iru yo ne? Oh, there are brown people in Japan too. In this moment, there are over 120,000 South Asians in Japan, and yet my presence felt unprecedented. I found myself hungering for recognition. I craved the sensation of being seen in all of my fullness. And yet, when people saw my face, all they could think of was that spicy naan and curry set that they had the other day. My identity was flattened to a brownness that was just the most easy to consume. Often, upon first being introduced to people, they would exclaim that I looked just like Jasmine from Disney's Aladdin. If only I had a magic carpet to show them a whole new world. Then, when I would explain to people that I'm Indian, and I'm a full-time college student in America, now studying away in Tokyo, they would often be quite confused. This felt like too many different places and movements to manage. But I'm not an exchange student in America. My parents do still live in India. My imagination roams across borders and time zones. And I consider myself something of a local in New Delhi, in St. Paul, Minnesota, and now in Tokyo. My sense of belonging is multiple.
Sheep's wool, unkempt, dirty, unprofessional. These were words used to describe my hair growing up. I quickly learned that societal expectations in my hair were often at odds. But if in the US I experienced questions about my hair, whether it be wrapped in braids or natural or straightened, I knew the questions in Japan were inevitable. So to make things easier for myself, I braided my hair and went. The week I landed in Tokyo, I was hungry. I wanted to go grab a snack by my dorm at the nearest convenience store. As I'm waiting in line to check out, I feel my braids being lifted into the air, and I turn to see an older Japanese man bewildered. Eh? Nani kore? What's this? Ah, sugoi ne, a younger woman adds as she joins him on my scalp. Frankly, I was shocked. Watashi no kami desu. It's my hair. My hair was the constant topic of discussion, whether I'm at the park with friends. So are those dreadlocks? No. Then what are they? I'm waiting to cross the street. Wow, your perm looks amazing. It's not a perm, it's my hair. I'm in the dorm bathroom twisting my hair before bed, being ogled at by my floor mates. There are moments when I was on the train and people were plotting to touch my hair behind me as if I didn't understand Japanese, leading me to gently swat away curious hands. I was called Nicki Minaj, Beyonce, hip hop, any form of blackness they could throw onto me. But I knew that their intentions were not ill. But the conversations and the touching and the stares were exhausting. I'm more than just my hair.
All of our identities affect how we walk through the world, but it was often the case that our most visible characteristic became our most defining.
With intersectionality, we get to be more. We get to be students,
Sisters,
Daughters,
Mentors,
activists,
post-colonials,
technologists,
multicultural,
capable.
intelligent.
creative.
resilient.
We become more colorful, vibrant, and rounded.
We began to learn how to communicate our identity across lines of difference and misunderstanding, but so often we were met with pure resistance. Many were unwilling to reconsider their preconceived notions.
In the face of globalization as we know it, bodies and cultures travel across borders like never before. Although some of us can belong anywhere we go, for others, there's still more of a struggle to find our place.
No one expected us to understand, much less speak, Mandarin or Japanese, but we can and do. We chose to take up space in places where our bodies were constantly questioned, offended, and misunderstood.
Which made being in these spaces a challenge. We had to find new ways to negotiate and express difference. And, just to ask questions about what it means to be the way we are in different parts of the world.
Many of our fears and hesitations were realized, but we had to find the strength within our journeys to overcome those obstacles.
We are not fragments. Each of us is greater than the sum of our parts. Whether or not people recognize this or have the cultural vocabulary for it does not take it away from us.
We expanded our perspectives. Our minds grew, as did the minds of those around us.
And our experiences did leave us with more questions than answers. Like, how can we, have conversations about race and ethnicity in a context outside of that of the United States?
As the world globalizes, how will culture and language expand to include ways to think and talk about marginalized populations?
We each worked hard to be able to study abroad. How do we make the most of our time in spite of becoming the target of negative comments and racial insensitivity?
The default body never was and is not that of the white man. So how can our institutions think beyond the norm and begin to center the lived experiences of racialized and gendered identities of people like us?
Thank
Thank
you.
you.